Are you pregnant or a new parent looking to ensure a better postpartum experience? Or are you a birth worker looking to improve your postpartum care skills? Check out Thriving After Birth, an online self-paced course by me, midwife and educator Tanya Tringali. It's 10 and a half hours of video content featuring experts in lactation, mental health, pelvic floor health, pediatric sleep issues. You also get worksheets and a workbook, as well as options to have a one-on-one session with me. Sign up at motherwitmaternity.com/thriving, and let's improve postpartum care together. Today is Robin Bradley. She is a certified nurse midwife who practiced in Westchester County, which is just north of New York City, for her entire 30-plus year career. Robin and Kathy, who you recently heard talking with me about painful sex in the postpartum period, are the two most important midwives in my personal journey to becoming a midwife. They took me under their wing and taught me everything they knew. Robin is here today to tell her birth stories. As you may know, the birth stories of midwives and other birth workers often weave in the birth, so to speak, of their professional journeys, and Robin's is no exception. Oh, and a gentle reminder that nothing we discuss on this show should ever be considered medical advice. Please speak to your local provider about anything that comes up in this show that resonates with you and your needs and your health care. Robin, thanks for being here. If you would start off by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself.
So I'm Robin Bradley. The first birth story, though, is as Robin Fishman in a previous marriage, in a previous life. I'm now retired, newly retired for a year from a life that was integral to everything I believed I was. I started thinking about women's reproduction in like fourth grade. And back in the day, because I'm old, I went to the library in fourth grade to take out a book about reproduction. So this is before you got the fifth or sixth grade conversation about your period. And deodorants and all that stuff. And the librarian wouldn't let me take the book out. And she said I had to have my mother's permission. And I went home and I asked my mother, and my mother was like really open about a lot of things and really not open about, but the more I was willing to go read stuff in a book, she was really happy. So I took the book out and I was fascinated. And I would watch puppies whelp, their dogs whelp puppies, and I would watch kittens being born. And I just thought reproduction was the most fascinating thing I had ever seen before. And then I became a candy striper, and I was volunteering at White Plains Hospital, and I just somehow ended up on the postpartum unit with all these nurses telling me at 14 years old all these really cool stories about sex and birth and labor and then one of my good friends was 6 years older than I was, and she was pregnant, and she and her husband got pregnant and decided to have a baby, and they were at the hospital, and I actually got to see it. So I was I think I was 17. And I got to witness this birth. And she was one of the early Lamaze people, really early Lamaze people. And so they just all thought she was crazy. But I just couldn't figure out how I was going to be a part of this. How was I going to make this? And back then, the only way anybody could think of was either you became an obstetrician or you became a nurse. I ended up getting engaged to be married at 18. I was married at 19, and everybody thought that I was going to quit college. I was going to just become, one of those people that got lost in the whatever. But I was absolutely committed to doing something. And initially, short term, all I could think of was I would go to nursing school, and then I could start to earn some money, and that I would probably become an obstetrician. But I went to Columbia University, and the OB residents there were nuts. They were so driven. They just weren't interested in women. But there was a midwifery program that I didn't really know very much about. But, I have to backtrack. I was at Syracuse my freshman year in college because I thought that I should go away before I got married. I should go away and live on my own. Anyway, while I was there, I met Sister, might have been Angela Murtaugh.
That's who I thought you were going to say.
But she came to talk to our nursing class, and we all started talking about what were our thoughts and where were we going, in nursing. And I shared with her that my love for, for birth and women's health. And she was so funny. She gave me an article from the newspaper about midwives. And she said, I don't think you want to be an obstetrician. I think this is what you want to be. And I was like, it was actually a story about Therese Dondero. Of course, I hunted down Therese Dondero and to find out found out that she was right in our backyard. And we got to be friendly, and we met at Lamaze meetings and stuff. Anyway, I was just enthralled. She became sort of who I thought I was going to become. Anyway, so I went to Columbia and decided that I was going to take the MCATs. And then I realized I was just going to be a chameleon. I was going to become one of those docs that I didn't want to be, because there weren't very many women in obstetrics at the time. And I wasn't sure I was strong enough to hold out and stick to my guns. So I graduated from nursing school and got a job in labor and delivery right out of school. It taught me very early how to multitask and how to put women in charge of what they were doing. But it was also in the days before we had Pitocin pumps, and we didn't have we had a fetal monitor. So my birth. Okay, so I get pregnant. My head nurse is pissed as shit at me because I've only been there for 3 months. I agree to stay literally right till the second I go into labor. And I promised to come back afterwards. And I was fascinated. I loved being pregnant. It was like I was a science experiment for myself, and I was married to a different man the first time, and he was connected, but he was kind of like whatever I wanted to do. Like I clearly knew what I wanted, and whatever I needed to do, I was going to do. All right. So now enter Therese Dondero again. And I'm like, Tara, I'm pregnant. And she's like, oh, that's wonderful. I see her for a visit. I see my gynecologist, who was lovely, but when he fitted me for a diaphragm the first time, right before I got married, he showed me how to put it in, but he forgot to tell me how to take it out. I couldn't get it out, and I had to go to the emergency room after 3 days because I couldn't get the suction to release. And I was mortified, absolutely mortified. And it made me, it played out in my midwifery care going forward forever. I always made sure that somebody could take out their diaphragm before they left the office. Anyway.
Well, I always tell my students that sometimes the best learning is learning what not to do, right? Like there's so many times where you have to learn something from somebody who maybe you're not like digging their way. And those are the things that really stick in your mind just as well as the most amazing things that people can teach you. So that is illustrated.
Absolutely. So I went to see my gynecologist, and he was the one who told me I was pregnant. Back in those days, you had to wait for the rabbit to die. No, the rabbit to die. And it took a couple of days for me to find out that I was pregnant.
What are you talking about, frogs and rabbits?
Well, in the old days, there were no real, a pregnancy test. What they would do was inject pregnant urine into an animal. It was a rabbit usually, and check, and then they would have to take their ovaries out and see if anything had happened. Anyway, it was so bizarre. And you had to wait 8 weeks. So you were
and so by then you kind of know you're pregnant.
Maybe, but I had no signs. Other than the fact that my period didn't come, I didn't feel weird. Anyway, so when I went to him, and he went through the very, very rudimentary stuff about being pregnant. And I told him that I was actually considering going to a midwife. And he had been trained at Yale and trained with midwives up there. And I knew that. And he actually had the balls to say to me, Robin, if you need someone to hold your hand, by all means, why don't you hire somebody to come and hold your hand? But what you really need is an obstetrician. And I never forgot that piece of it, because what we all find out is that having somebody hold your hand when you're pregnant is probably the most important thing. There's a whole lot of other things that will happen because somebody's held your hand, and things that you're willing to share with them because they've been willing to hold your hand. So I just thought that was very telling. I went with Therese, and she announced to me that she was leaving the practice at Einstein so that she could start the practice at North Central Bronx.
So I recognize that there's been a fair amount of name dropping and names of practices that people all over the country or the world won't recognize. I will put some things together in the show notes for those of you that are interested, either because you're regional or you really love midwifery history. But for the rest of you, just continue to enjoy the story.
I continued to work and worked right literally up to, I think, the day before I went into labor. My fear in that birth was that I would be out of control. And I'm a control freak from way back. And I had seen so many births that women had an intention, but didn't have the support to follow through on that intention, and were sidetracked and derailed. And I had this fear that if I didn't stay totally on top of everything, that could happen. I had this fear. We had a drug called scopolamine in the old days, and it was the cocktail scopolamine and Demerol, and you went to basically into La La Land. And I refused to let them put an IV in so that they couldn't have access to medicate me if I didn't want it. So
let me interrupt you. Is that the root of the fear of losing control, was that they would force you to take medication that you didn't want if you lost control?
I was worried that my husband, he'd never done any of this before. He'd never seen it before. And I'd educated him as much as I could and took him to classes, and, but I just, I know that it's hard, for guys, we put so much pressure on them, and, it was in the days before doulas. So I had my midwife, and actually a midwifery student from Yale, who I totally freaked out, but that's later in the story. And so I worried that I was going to be at Einstein with a bunch of residents, and I trusted Nancy implicitly. I just didn't trust the space. So I started into labor. I was at my mother, I was 11 days late. My mother thought that what would make me feel better and stop being so crabby would be to throw an anniversary party for my husband and I. And so that's what wasps do. So we had a party and everybody's out, bopping around, and I can't sit, I can't stand, I can just barely talk to people. Everybody's telling me their birth stories and what things I should try to go into labor and all this. Well, by the time I got home, I realized I was having contractions like every 5 or 6 minutes, and I'd probably been contracting pretty much all night. So I got all excited and called Nancy, and she had just come off of birth and she was tired, and she was like, I know, this is early. I was like, really? She was like, yeah, it's really early. Let's see how things go. I couldn't, so now I'm a labor and delivery nurse. Okay. And so I know all of these things in my brain, but now I'm actually physically feeling all of them. And I realize that I'm just anybody else. But I'm loving it, because I keep looking at my watch going, how the frig does my body know to have a contraction every 4 minutes? Like literally like some alarm gong went off and boom, I get a contraction. So we had a little 2-bedroom apartment sort of, and it was this long what's called a railroad setup, where it was just one long hallway. I must have put, God only knows how many miles I put on in that hallway that night, pacing, because I couldn't sit during contraction. Now, in retrospect, I figured out that I have a flat pelvis. I have a platyploid pelvis, and the way she was sitting in my pelvis was making it impossible for me to sit down. So I walked and walked and walked. And finally, around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, I called Nancy back and I was like, so now they're like, Nance, they're like at least 3, 4, 5 minutes apart now. And she was like, that's so great. And it's still so early. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. This is serious. And I could, in retrospect, I could just see the look on her face, even though we only had telephones. I could just imagine that she was just rolling her eyes. Anyway, but about a half an hour, 45 minutes later, I broke my water. And then the contractions really changed. And there was a toll booth on the Henry Hudson Parkway. I'm having contractions like now, they're every 3 minutes, and I can't sit when I have it. And I'm dripping ooze out of me. And I've stuffed as many, towels as I can, in the car. And we get to the first toll gate, and my husband can't find any money to like throw in the toll, and I can't sit. So I get out of the car and I'm walking around the car while he's trying to find money. And the toll guy is like waving at us, go, 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 Then we get to the next one, and and it's the same thing. Anyway, it was pretty comical. We get to Einstein, and they made me sit in a wheelchair. I looked at the transporter and I said, okay, if you're going to make me sit in this chair, you have 3 minutes to get me from here to labor and delivery, or I'm out of it. And they really believed me, and they got me to labor and delivery in under 3 minutes. But before I had left the house, Nancy said to me, do you mind if I just got home? Do you mind if a resident checks you? So it kind of fed into my fear that this wasn't going to go the way I wanted it to go. So I said yes. I didn't mind. So I get to labor and delivery. The resident comes in. She's older than I was, but not much. And she checks me, and I'm 3 whole centimeters. I was sure I was in transition. And the nurse in the room looks at me and says, and what do you do for a living? I was so pissed off that anyway, they basically insinuated that I was just barely in labor. it turns out my cervix was totally thinned out. I was that 3 centimeters that wants to be something else. And so I had a mitral valve prolapse. And so back in the day, nobody really knew that 70% of the female population has some semblance of a mitral valve prolapse that's probably functional and asymptomatic, but mine actually needed to be medicated. So they had to put an IV in to give me some antibiotics. So I said, okay, you can put it in and then you'll have to take it out. And they did. So anyway, I clearly was moving and they were clearly ignoring me. And so I had Einstein had this whole long hallway of rooms, and I was put in the farthest room away from the front door. And I walked around the labor and delivery halls. So I developed this mantra, and every time I would get a contraction, I would lean into the wall and I'd make a fist and I'd hit the wall and go, shit, fuck, piss, until the contraction was over. And then I would continue walking. And they were clearly picking up, and walking was lovely and it was helping. But then they wanted me to get back into bed. And Nancy was there by then. And she wanted to check, and sure enough, I was like 8 centimeters. So this is about a little less than 2 hours after I got there. So I really was in really good labor. And I said to her, so do you think I should have some medication? So she looked at me and she said, do you need it? And I was like, no, but do you think it's going to get worse? And she was like, Robin, I think this is as worse as it's going to get. And if you're okay, that's. So I remember getting up and going to the bathroom and wiping just copious amounts of mucus and blood and gore. And the nurse looking into the bed, I wouldn't come out of the bathroom. And the nurse finally pops her head in and she goes, that's not going to go away. It's just going to keep coming. So if you want to come out of the bathroom, you can, And then the next thing I knew, I was fully dilated. I had the most, well, I shouldn't say that. I had the most intense need to push. And it turned, was because of the position Lauren's head was in. But I only know this in retrospect. But I'm still I'm in the bed and I'm bearing down. And the Jerry, who was the midwifery student, is trying to explain to me how I shouldn't push. And so I did my best. She said, I still had a little rim of cervix, and please don't push because you're just going to swell it up. And of course, now I know that trying to tell somebody not to push is like telling them not to breathe. And she was only a midwifery student and didn't realize the extent of what she was actually asking me to do or not do. But also, in retrospect, I was sitting upright in bed, making the need to bear down so much worse that if she just laid me down and rolled me over on my side, we could have quieted the whole thing down and I wouldn't have been so annoying. But anyway.
So wait, I have to pause. I have to ask while we're in the moment here, at what point did you recognize some of the things you're saying that are in the vein of Monday morning quarterback? Like, did you figure this out in your first few days postpartum, thinking about your birth as a nurse, or did you have to go to midwifery school to completely go, oh, in my own birth, I should have done, where does that thought process come in that you're able to share with me now?
Some of it happened a couple of weeks later, because the rest of the story will help explain it. Some of the things that I did I realized in retrospect relatively quickly, by 6 weeks, that I might have been able to ameliorate, or might have been able to anyway. I finally got to be fully dilated, and Jerry came in, and I was really, really bearing down. And she tried to explain to me, but I was like, I have to push right now. And she, so she just backed off and let me push. Now, I pushed for almost 3.5 hours. And Two things were possible. One, it was the position of the baby's head. Two, it was the fact that I continued to push sitting up in bed. I never got out of bed. I never changed position. I wrote some of that off to the fact that neither one of them had ever been pregnant before. And some of this stuff we just didn't, we didn't really fully comprehend in those early days. We were still in a little bit of that model of this is what you do. I wasn't, they didn't take me right to the delivery room and nobody strapped me down and I was doing all the stuff I wanted to do. I just didn't understand that I probably, if I had changed positions or been up on all fours or gotten out of bed, I would have helped rotate her head. Or if I'd had a little bit of Pitocin to help rotate her head, I could have delivered her sooner.
But okay, how many hours had you been in labor at this point?
Not long, but I'd been pushing for almost 4 hours by that point.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
So, and with a head that was really low. I mean, she was, for all intents and purposes, everybody kept saying, she's right here. She's right. We didn't know it was a she. I thought it was a boy. So I didn't realize it, but there was meconium. And I finally get her to a point where she's crowning and I'm pushing. And Nancy says, Robin, if you can't do it in the next contraction or two, I might have to cut. And boom, I was able to push her out. I just found strength from God only knows where. But she came out covered in meconium. She wasn't out more than I heard Nancy say, Robin, it's Lauren, because we had a name for either whether a boy or a girl. Back then, nobody knew. I didn't have any ultrasounds. She said, oh, it's Lauren. And I was like, no, look again, it's Jeremy. And she was like, Robin, trust me, I know what a girl looks like. And that's the last thing I remember. I started to bleed. And I bled and bled and bled. And I could feel the blood oozing up behind my back. All I remember is a couple of people showed up in the room. And I had that out of body thing where you're up on top of the ceiling and you're watching this thing going on.
Wow.
And they got an IV in and started some PIT. I think I must have had Methergin, but I only remember the IV. And they took Lauren away right away. After that, after seeing her, the little green monster, they took her away. And it took a while for the bleeding to stop. And then Jerry, my student midwife, went to repair my bottom for the next hour and 15 minutes.
What did you have?
A very little second degree thing. Yeah, I think I don't know what number stitcher, what number person I was that she was putting back together again, but it took a long time. Up on a bedpan.
So, okay, that means they got your bleeding under control with meds.
They did. They
Okay,
stopped it. But by that point, I was still pretty. I have pictures of the color of me at that point. I mean, I'm pretty white, but I made the walls look, And it turned out I had bled down to a crit of 17 from 42. So they'd taken Lauren to the NICU. It wasn't a NICU back. Well, it was sort of a NICU, special care nursery back then, because this was 1978. And I didn't see her for a while, but I really couldn't. I finally went into postpartum, to the recovery room, and there were curtains around all of us. There were 4 of us in the room, and there were curtains around every bed, and they pulled the curtains, and they put one of the, the bells that you ring on the bedside stand just beyond where my hand could reach. And I remember being so frightened that I was just going to bleed to death behind that curtain and nobody was going to know.
Oh.
And finally, when I really got so frightened that I was willing to rock the boat and get somebody. I yelled, and the nurse came in like in a flash. I mean, she was literally probably on the other side of the curtain, but I didn't know that. And I told her that, I was scared. Could she please open the curtain so I could see people? And she did. And then I was like, I have to call my mom. I have to tell my mom that I had a baby, and they had to bring a phone in to the room. And I called and nobody answered. And I'm like, I've done this incredible thing and I can't tell anybody, and then we tried my in-laws and they didn't answer. And I was like, okay. Well, it turned out that my mother-in-law had called, being the lovely mother-in-law that she was, had called the hospital, and Einstein, the nursing staff, had told her that I'd had the baby. And she called my mother and told her that I had had a baby. That didn't go over well. But they'd all come to the hospital. And that's why nobody
They were all sitting in the waiting room and you didn't know it.
I had no idea. Neither of us did. Jeff didn't know that they were there
Well,
yet.
it's weird that the nurses didn't know. Here they are handing you a phone to call them, but
well, the waiting room was like there were no cell phones. There were phones. That was it. And people could have sat in the waiting room for days. Nobody would have known they were there.
Well, it's like did you ever watch the show Mad Men?
Mm-hmm.
So I, for whatever reason, I'm having these images of every time that Don Draper had a baby, like the smoking in the waiting room and just like the endless waiting.
Absolutely. And that was my in-laws and my parents, but we were the trendy couple. We were with the midwives, and we were, so everything I wanted, I had arranged to leave the hospital in 12 hours because I really didn't want to be there. And I'd arranged for a pediatrician to see us the very next morning. And I had all these plans. I had all this stuff planned out about how I was going to leave. And now I had no way of standing up because I had no blood. So the first thing was that the resident came in and told me that they would like to give me a transfusion. Okay. It's 1978 and hepatitis is just getting to show its head. And I was like, no, I'm really good. I'm fine. I don't need any blood. And she said, but you can't stand up. I was like, oh yeah, I can watch. And I walked, sheer willpower. I walked to the bathroom, sat there, peed, put my head between my legs really quietly so I wouldn't pass out, peed, got back up and went back to bed. And I was like, see, I'm fine. Yeah, I didn't do that anymore for the rest of the day. I desperately wanted to breastfeed. And my mother had wanted to breastfeed us as kids, but the nurses told her that her boobs were too little. She had little Irish boobs. And so they told her they were too small. And the nurses, said it was very sweet of her to think about trying to breastfeed, but she really didn't have the right equipment. So I am hell-bent that I am going to nurse. It didn't even occur to me. I don't think we even really knew about the impact of postpartum hemorrhage and milk supply, but for whatever, it didn't affect me at all. So I wasn't even worried about it. But Lauren was ravenous when they finally brought her out, and she was in special care. She had transient tachypnea of newborn, and was just breathing so fast. But when I would nurse her, she would quiet down. And I tried to explain to them that if they would just let me keep her in the room, I could keep her calmer. And they weren't having it. But anyway, they did bring her out to me all the time. And I nursed her. And the next morning. So I had her in the middle of the afternoon. So the next afternoon, my milk started to come in. She'd been nursing so ravenously. And I had this kind of very preppy kind of gown thing that my mother had given me, because that's what you do when you go to the hospital to have a baby, and matching slippers and the whole 9 yards. Anyway, so my boobs literally are doing one of these, like somebody inflated them by like every 10 or 15 minutes. They were getting bigger and bigger. And my mother is sitting on the end of the bed watching me nurse and trying to console me that it's not going to work. And she's watching my boobs getting bigger. And she, all of a sudden she looks and she goes, could mine have done that too? And I was like, yeah. So it was, it was such, and we didn't know very much about breastfeeding. I have to say, we just didn't know very much about breastfeeding in the 70s. We knew what we thought we wanted, but we still had a lot of fairy tales and a lot of misinformation and a lot of bad information.
I'm thinking about those nurses that said what they said to your mom, and that really puts into perspective for me the timeline on when we lost our connection to breastfeeding, right? Because you were born in the 50s, right?
Right. I was born in the 50s. My mother, so, when you talk about that timeline, my mother's mother, my grandmother, she was off the boat from Ireland. So when she got here, she wanted to do everything the modern way here in America. So she had all of her kids at the hospital. And my mother was breastfed, but my mother supposedly never able to breastfeed her own kids. And I saw prescriptions for formula for my brother and I that were Karo Syrup with vitamins put in it. No
freaking way.
Yes, it was. And then they would start to add a little bit of milk protein to it. But the original one, the first prescription was for vitamins. There were definitely vitamins in Karo Syrup.
This is a really interesting historical fact that I'm now going to have to go research. Thank you, Robin. I needed one more thing to do.
Yep. And my mother had like one of those Tara, like 18-inch waists. It was disgusting. She was like this model figure, And when she got to 18 pounds, they put her on carrots and celery and martinis and her cigarettes.
I was just going to say, and cigarettes.
I have a picture she was a Tareyton smoker, and I have a picture of her the week before I was born. She's at a New Year's Eve party with my dad, and a drink in one hand and a cigarette in the other hand.
That's insane. And it really, really infuriates me to hear these stories, because not that we need to go down this road, but I think about your health and just what it means to have been a baby, a fetus in utero, who survived all of that. Like, you're so smart. Imagine how much smarter you would have been.
Well, on top of that, I was breech. So in labor, they realized I was breech and turned me. And my mother got one of the first caudals that the hospital ever did.
Okay, you gotta tell our listeners what that means.
They had just developed this new anesthesia method that you could put an anesthetic into a space around the base of the spine. So it wasn't even up high like epidurals, when people talk about epidurals now. Caudals were literally so that you could put a pair of forceps on and not feel it. It was given at the last minute. It wasn't given early. It was given for second stage, which was like the easiest part of the whole freaking labor. And when I told my mother that she missed the best part, she was like, what?
How old is Lauren when you get divorced and remarried and all of that? Because I want our listeners also to hear your second birth story.
So I ended up separating. I got married to get out of my house, and we had a lovely relationship, but it wasn't a good marriage, and it wasn't going anywhere. I was growing faster than he was, and it turned out he had a brain tumor, and he had a malignant glioma. And at 34, he was 6 years older than I was. So Lauren was 3 when I separated. And about 9 or 10 months later, we found out about the glioma, and he was dead a year later.
Wow.
So she was 5 when he died. But I had met a man who was, the antithesis of everything I lived till then. My first husband was a teacher on the Upper West Side. He taught history, and he loved music and technology, and we had every new gadget ever came out. And my second husband was a cop, because nurses and cops just hang out in bars together. So we met, we fell in love, and we got married. Anyway, I decided I was very bad at being married, and I wasn't going to get married ever again. So we lived together for a while, and he had asked me to marry him, and I was like, no, that's a bad idea. I'm really bad at it. You don't want to be married to me. This is just fine. We can just keep doing this. And he had a son from his previous marriage, and the kids were great together. But we did start talking about having a baby. We were talking about having a baby. But I desperately wanted to go to midwifery school, and I'd already just before I got divorced, I had applied, and there were only 6 midwifery schools in the United States at that time, and they didn't think that I had enough labor and delivery experience. So
what?
I know, right? So by that point, I'd only been in labor and delivery for the first time I applied. I'd only been in labor and delivery for 3 years. And back then, to get into school, you had to have 5 years of labor and delivery experience.
That's ridiculous.
Well, it is and it isn't. I think, well, you and I have had
5 years is excessive. And we're in a phase, which we won't go down this road because it will belabor our podcast
Right.
episode, but we're in a phase where we're rethinking whether or not that's even appropriate at all to say somebody needs labor and delivery experience. And you and I might not agree on that topic.
I was gonna say, that you and I are going in a different place on this one.
Yes.
But
Anyway,
I had done almost 200 births by the time, because
Right.
nobody showed up.
But five, that's what I'm saying.
But so I got to do all of that easy stuff, the taxi driver deliveries, so that by the time I got to midwifery school, they got to teach me the nuances of it. So I was already at least a year beyond where most midwifery students start now. So I had gotten turned down the first time. So my fiance, well, we weren't engaged, but I applied again. And at that point we were in New York, but I still applied to Michigan. I applied to all of them. And he said to me, wait a minute, if you get into school out in Michigan, what are you going to do? And I was like, I'm going to go. And it changed our relationship a bit. And it became much more, now we have to figure out how to be a couple. And I told Jimmy that the midwives had suggested that we get married. And so we put together a wedding. We got married 6 weeks later, and I started midwifery school. Okay, so I start midwifery school. I love it. Absolutely. Just the commute out to Brooklyn, was crazy. I'd never been in Brooklyn before. I didn't know what it was like a whole other world, but I loved it. Part of my rotation I did at maternity center, because I thought that I was going to hook up with this woman, Julietta Ackerman, and we were going to have a birth center. Therese Dondero, and I were going to have this birth center in White Plains. And so Lily Shaw, who was the dean of the program at the time, did everything she could to get me experience out of hospital kinds of experiences. She was the most incredible dean. She was just so connected to all of the students. Anyway, I graduate, and one of the docs who I'd become good friends with, who was going to help us with the birth center, we'd gone down to Reading to see Kitty Ernst's birth center in Reading, and he was all on board. And I was teaching him about how to deliver babies without an episiotomy. He was teaching me everything he could from a medical perspective. It was a great relationship, and they agreed to hire me. And I was there and building the practice. I graduated in 85, and it was an incredibly wonderful symbiotic relationship. He had no ego in the game. You want to learn it? Here, come, I'll show you how to do it. Taught me how to do DNC because he said at some point in my lifetime, it was going to become illegal to do abortions again. This was 1985. And I was like, Mel, you've got to be kidding. That is never, ever going to happen. Women are going to be totally connected to the fact that they have this right now. So he showed me how to do a DNC. Anyway, I took out my IUD one day, just because it was due to be changed, and totally forgot. I have sex that night, and unbeknownst to me, I'm ovulating, but I don't realize it until the next morning when I go, oh my God, I don't have an IUD. And this was 1985. It was like, so anyway, I just knew I was pregnant. Nothing could have happened, and nothing had happened then, but I just knew. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, I'm like, no period, no nothing.
So in 1985, how long does it take for the rabbit or the frog to die?
So now now this is 10 years later. Now you could actually do a test in the office.
Oh, good.
And I go into the bathroom, I test, and it comes up positive, and I'm sobbing in the bathroom. I don't know how to tell my husband that oh, by the way, I know we were talking about getting pregnant, but well, guess what? Conversation's over. He was ecstatic. He was absolutely ecstatic. Okay. So now I'm the only midwife at White Plains Hospital. They just barely put up with my silliness at the hospital because the chief of the department, is my boss. And I don't yet have delivery privileges. And so I'm going to births as a doula, essentially. And sometimes when Mel was there, we would close the door and I would do the delivery. Nobody would ever know. We were desperately trying to get me privileges. So again, we're not doing ultrasounds routinely. And I get to about 18, 19 weeks, and I blow up. And I was also had been at Norwalk. The perinatologist there looked at me and he goes, oh, that's more than one baby. And I was like, no, I just carry big, So sure enough, fast forward about 4 or 5 months, and I blow up over a weekend, and I'm like, okay, something is really seriously wrong here. There is way too much fluid here. And my partner Bonnie takes a look at my belly, and she listens, and she goes, maybe we should just get an ultrasound. Now, she heard 2 heartbeats. She just was too chicken to tell me. So and I'm trying to explain to my husband that, what the possibilities are, not even considering the fact, I'm just thinking polyhydramnios, too much fluid. I'm not even thinking that there's more than one baby there. And we go to Elliot to have an ultrasound, and I'm laying there, and he's actually making fun of me because I agreed to have an ultrasound. And so he goes, oh, so here's one. And he goes, and here's the other one. And I burst into tears again.
Oh my
and
God.
So, I realized that my whole life plan has just been flushed down the toilet because I'm going to have all these kids, and how that, I've been just barely pulling through, at this point. So my husband thinks it's the most wonderful thing he's ever seen, and he has super sperm, and that's how the whole thing happened. And we're too far along at that point. We're 20 weeks, and so there's no way to tell whether they were fraternal or identical. But they were thinking that they were probably identical, and I didn't want to know what sex they were. So all they kept saying was that they were growing literally in lockstep with each other. Nothing bad happened during the pregnancy. I mean, I got really big. I was huge.
How many weeks did you carry them to?
My due date.
You did. You carried your twins to 40 weeks. I love it.
I did. And, back then nobody did it. And so I had this whole delusion. We had just created a birthing room. So I was going to deliver them in the birthing room. And Mel was like, "Are you nuts?" And he said, at some point, we will have to go to the delivery room. A, because you tried to bleed to death the first time, and B, because both of them were head down right till about 3 weeks before I delivered. And then the one of them popped up transverse. And so we had to talk about what the possibilities were if he couldn't get this second baby down from being transverse, because one was nicely engaged in my pelvis, but the other one, and making it impossible to walk around. And the other one was literally draped back up and draped over its sibling. Okay, so now we have to have a conversation about where I'm going to be delivering in my own hospital with a lot of eyes watching how I do this, and feeling like I'm going to be on display.
Yeah.
And so I had my two best friends come to be with me. Totally useless. Okay. Totally useless at the time. The two of them cried for most of my labor. I wouldn't let anybody put me on a monitor. I locked the door at one point. I locked my labor door at one point and wouldn't let anybody in. My partner, Larry Jackman, kept walking by in the hall going, "Robin, monitor." And I put it on for a couple of minutes. I'd make sure the kids were okay. I could feel them moving. I could feel everybody moving. And I had horrible back labor. She's really posterior and just killing my back. It felt like every time I had a contraction, somebody shoved a knife in my sacrum and just rotated it. And I would put my arms around my husband's neck and just drop to the floor. And he was so wonderful. He was just whatever I needed. He tells the story about he bought breakfast, he brought lunch, he bought dinner. My water broke. So my water broke before I really started to labor, but within a couple of seconds, I started having contractions. So that was part of the problem, because she was already wedged so deeply into the pelvis when I broke my water. But Morgan, who turned out to be the second one, was still draped, and I was huge. I mean, I was 40 weeks. The girls were almost 7 pounds each. And so I labored. I got to the hospital like 7 a.m. I got to 8 centimeters by the late afternoon, and I got stuck. And I said to Mel, "I just need a little bit of pit." And he was like, "Robin, you are so distended. I'm worried that you're going to rupture the uterus." Honestly, in retrospect, I think there were so many eyes outside my room. The ex-chief of the department, who hated my guts anyway, he was there. He had a patient in labor. Everybody was second guessing Mel, letting me continue with this transverse. And I kept saying to him, "If we just get the first one out, her head's all the way down here. She'll just come flying out, Anyway, he says, no, he really can't. And he said, "Why don't we try an epidural? Let's see if that helps relax the cervix. lets the contractions get stronger. And so we did. I did an epidural to, against my better judgment at the time, but I kind of felt like that I had to try something. So it was really hard to augment the contractions with nipple stim when I had to create that kind of back pain. So once I had the epidural, then I could do it. And I had stashed some herbs in my purse, and I was doing those. And I got better. I think I really got to 8 to 9 centimeters, but we did that for about 6 hours. And back then that was totally unheard of. And finally, Jimmy was outside the room, and Mel came up to him, and Mel said, "You have to talk to her. We need to call it a day." And I think Mel was afraid to tell me that he wanted to section me. So Jimmy came in and he said, "Listen, they're my babies too, and everybody really feels like you've done as much as you possibly can, and they really need to do a section." So I cried. I cry a lot actually when I'm under duress. But anyway, I started to cry, and I was like, "But I just need some Pitocin," and they just wouldn't do it. And so I agreed. And I said to them, "But I bleed." And I had a unit of blood put away. My mom gave me a unit back in, because now it's 1987. I mean, yeah, 1987, and AIDS is in full bloom.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
And so we go in, and so sure enough, Megan was so deep in my pelvis. They decided to try and get Morgan first. She was up under my rib cage, and they ended up. So back in the day, this was before Fannin Steels, before they did an incision across your pubic bone. So I had this midline incision because they thought on the external wall, because they thought they were going to need more room, which they kind of did. They go up to get Morgan, they drag her out of the trees, and then they go to get Megan, and Megan is no sooner out, and I start to bleed.
Oh boy, here you go again.
And now I'm laying on an operating table, and my favorite anesthesiologist is up at my head, and I've got the two guys I trust more than God, and I can hear the blood hitting the floor. And I remember saying to Larry Jackman, who was on my left side, I was like, "Larry, I'm bleeding." He goes, "I got it." And he had a tone of voice that changed when he was stressed. We knew each other. The three of us knew each other like the back of our hands. And so I heard him ask for Methergin, and they gave me some Methergin, and I said, "I'm going to throw up." And two of them were like, "Don't." And then the bleeding got worse. And I was like, "Guys, I'm starting to get really lightheaded. I'm feeling like I'm leaving my body." And Larry actually yelled at me and told me to stop talking like that. And they finally got the bleeding under control, but it took a while. And
would you drop your crit to this time?
Another 17. When I was at Einstein with Lauren, there was no such thing as rooming in, but they brought the baby to me all the time, and I had access to her, and whatever. We were just starting to talk about rooming in at White Plains Hospital at that point. And I knew I had seen it in other places, and we weren't reinventing the wheel. And anyway, I was adamant that I was not going to separate from these kids, and that I wanted Lauren and Michael to have access to their sisters. So the kids come in to see me that next morning. I put them in yellow gowns, and I wrap each one of the, Jimmy wraps each one of the kids up and gives each one of the kids a baby. And one of the nurses walks in. and absolutely lost her mind and told me that the babies couldn't go back to the nursery now because they were going to have to be in isolation and they were contaminated now. And
Perfect. I love contaminated babies.
okay, I love contaminated babies too, except they were so mad at me that they kind of decided that retribution was going to be that I was going to have to take care of them by myself.
Yeah, I realized that as soon as the words came out of my mouth, as I was making that joke, I was like, oh, she's got a C-section and twins on her hands. That's not very nice to me.
Yeah. So there was this one nurse who would come in at night and just watch me, like kind of voyeurish, watch me while I was breastfeeding. But it turned out that the girl, so one of the things I failed to say about Lauren's birth was, in retrospect, she was tongue-tied, and breastfeeding was horrible for about 7 weeks. Anyway, it turned out the twins were tongue-tied too. Again, I didn't know what tongue-tied meant. I just know that every time I put them to the breast, it felt like they were biting my nipples off. And I'm very stubborn. Did I say that? So I was just hell-bent on the fact that those kids were not getting formula and I was going to breastfeed them. And I did. Finally, around 2 weeks, they were eating so much that I actually thought I have to give them a bottle. I don't know how to do this. Like, what the hell is the matter with the two of you? Like, nobody could need this much food. And they refused to take a bottle. And now I'm supposed to be starting this new job at Norwalk that I've accepted. And I've put off from instead of 6 weeks, I've put it off to 8 weeks. And I can't get them to take a bottle. And all they want to do is breastfeed constantly. And they are doing really well. And they're really cute and they look really identical. So we never take their clothes off at the same time. Only one kid gets its clothes off at once to get bathed or whatever, because I'm pretty sure at some point or another in the first week or two, I think we switched the names of who they were. But anyway, they had one of them had a mole on the inside of her nose. There was a little tiny freckle that was how we were able to tell who was who. And when I went in for my postpartum check, I drove myself and I took the girls. You think back on these things, I'm like, what was I thinking? Anyway, I put them in their car seats and I take them to my appointment. And Mel and I have a long chat about the birth. And Bonnie, my other partner, says to me, if I'd been there, I would have given you Pitt. Well, that just pushed me over the edge. And it took me a while to come to terms with the fact that if I'd been in a hospital that wasn't my own and hadn't been on display, that maybe people might have been feeling less judged and would have been willing to at least try. I don't know. I don't know. But I felt like I had done it the first time. And yes, the situation was different. The twins' positions were what they were. And maybe Pitocin wouldn't have worked. And maybe I would have really bled at that, with that and uncontrollably, since they couldn't grab a hold of my uterus. But I don't know.
But it was not one in which anyone, no matter how many years of experience you have, can Monday morning quarterback. Like,
nope, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And so, you try as a midwife to disengage your birth from all the rest of the births you do for the rest of your career. And what became very, very important to me was that women not feel out of control and that they be an integral part of everything, and that I would do anything I had to do to make their make their birth, make their labor what they wanted, as opposed to what I wanted or what I needed. And, people would started talking soon after that. So I got privileges to do deliveries and 3 years later, because we threatened to sue the hospital. And there was a big march by all the childbirth educators who, to this day, to my dying day, I will owe them my career.
So did you ever go to Norwalk, or did you end up staying at White Plains?
So I went for one day. So I went for orientation, and I went and started my my first day of call. I worked a couple of days in the clinic, but now I have my first day of call, which was 24 hours. And my best friend had Judy had the girls with Jimmy, and every 3 or 4 hours she would call me and she would say, I'm trying. They won't drink, they won't take anything, they won't take a bottle, they won't do anything, they're just So I got home after my first 24 hours and realized that my kids literally went 24 hours without eating. I'd had conversations with the pediatrician, and she just kept giving me different ideas, the usual stuff that we tell moms about kids who fight bottles. And she just said, when kids get hungry enough, they'll eat. And I'm like, okay. They've gone 36 hours without eating anything, and they're wailing, but starting to wail, that raspy wail. And I remember Anne saying to me, Robin, I don't know how to tell you this, but there are some kids that will never take a bottle.
Yeah, I had one of them myself. So I do believe there's a rare kid that won't take a bottle.
Well, they were identical. So they did it the same way, and they refused. And I didn't know what to do. That night I pumped 10 ounces out of each breast of breast milk every 3 to 4 hours through the night.
That's
and
insane.
I'm like, what the hell? And the girls did fine, but they nursed every 2 hours. But I would come home every 3 hours or so to feed, in between patients. We only lived about 4 minutes from the office. I'd come home, I'd feed them. I'd go back to work. I'd go back home, during my break in the afternoon, I'd feed them. And then as soon as I got home from the office, I would feed them again. We went to the beach. They were 18 months old. We were at the beach, and some little kid at the blanket next to us had, the classic bottle. Morgan goes over and grabs this kid's bottle and starts sucking on it. And I'm like, are you freaking kidding me at this point at 18 months? You think you're getting a bottle? No way. I am not going to have to break you from anyway. It was.
That's funny.
Yeah.
So, okay, question for you.
Sure.
And you might have two answers. I'm curious because, in your story, you span a lot of time between, telling the part where you are so young and become a labor and delivery nurse to having a baby, and then midwifery school and more babies, and then 30 years more practice after that. I think I'm losing track of time here, but you've seen practice change and technology change. And I guess I should say technology change, and as a byproduct, practice change. You've seen that happen in a way that I won't ever see happen, right? So much of the way practice has been fairly static in my 20 years because fetal monitor.
Do you think so?
No, it's true. I mean, I'm not saying nothing has changed, but the changes are much more subtle. So
Yes,
you have
they
gone
are.
from what you started with frogs and rabbits, for God's sakes. I mean, you started your story with this and I didn't even know what you were talking about. So the way in which you watched practice change is not something my generation is going to see. And I wonder if you can speak to how you feel about this, both as a woman, a birthing person, but also as a midwife and a birthing professional. What do you think we're getting right? And what do you think we're getting wrong at this point, as you are now retired and can reflect a little bit?
So when it's upsetting on a couple of levels. So when I first started looking into birth. Lamaze had just started, and Bradley had, Lamaze had started in France, and Bradley had started here in Colorado with their birthing methods. Lamaze in Paris was a very different Lamaze than was brought here to the United States. I studied with Elizabeth Noble, who was the woman who brought it to the United States. Marjorie Carmel was the woman who delivered those babies in Paris and brought this method to Elizabeth Noble here in the States. I ended up delivering Marjorie Carmel's daughter. That was probably one of the most incredible highlights of my career. I explained to her, her mother had died of breast cancer. Marjorie died at 33 of breast cancer. But I explained to her that her mother was one of the reasons that I did what I did and that I knew what I knew. It was an incredible birth. But I met some of the most, I met Le Boyer on his first trip to the United States when he started talking about gentle birth. I met most of the early movers and shakers. Ina May Gaskin, we would meet up every time some major thing happened. She'd have a soapbox that she'd be on, and she'd be chatting it up. And we knew each other over the span of 40 years. So I started practicing. We didn't have ultrasound at the beginning. It was just new, but the guys that I was working with, Mel and Larry, went to Yale and learned it. They were in the cutting edge of learning how to do ultrasound. We had ultrasound in the office. We did abortions in the office. We turned babies in the office. We did breaches, by the time somebody was 32 weeks, if they were still breached, then we started flipping those kids around in the office. And so the numbers of breaches that we had were much lower. The reigning opinion was they were about 3% of the population at that point. Ours was much lower. I started looking into acupuncture for helping to turn the ones that we couldn't. They were loving it. We were doing it. We did a study on what the potential was, and how many more went, with just ignoring them versus acupuncture and moxibustion, and in the days before it, when it still smelled like marijuana in the office, and everybody'd be looking around like, what?
As far as I know, it still smells like marijuana. I've only
no. So now in Chinatown, you can get it. In Chinatown, you can get it without an odor.
Oh,
that was much better. Yeah, it was much better. We did have fetal monitors, and then all of a sudden we had fetal monitors, and then when I first started as a nurse at White Plains Hospital, one of the doctors, I had a patient in labor, and one of the doctors said to me, so now this is in the late 70s. One of the doctors was like, you should get her IV in. And I was like, why? And now I had just come from United Hospital, where they told me how expensive IVs were and how you shouldn't use them unless you absolutely had to. And now I have these doctors telling me she could die. And I'm like, wait a minute. So are the women in White Plains like that much more sensitive than the women in Portchester? Like, what's wrong with the women in White Plains? I was just finding I was teaching childbirth classes. I was just finding my voice. And the head of the department, I wore scrub dress when I was at United, and I found I couldn't get up on beds and maneuver and help and massage and do whatever I had to do. So I started wearing scrubs, and the chief of the department came in and saw that I had scrub pants on, and he was like, so who wears the pants in your family? And I said, we both do, because I really don't like showing people my underwear all the time. And I got taken down to the nursing office on a regular basis. My head nurse just would shake her head every time we'd have to go down because I'd overstepped my bounds. And I had a patient who had really horrible back labor, And I kept flipping her up onto all fours or under, whatever position would get her off her back that she was comfortable. And the chief of the department, who really wasn't my best friend, came in finally the last time. He said, I told you to put her on her back, and I mean it. And if you can't follow directions, you'll need to be taken off this case. And I just said to him, do you know what that feels like? And he said, no, I don't need to. I'm the doctor. And it was just stuff like that I just couldn't, I knew I couldn't last. I mean, I really knew I was going to get fired at some point if I stayed too much longer. If somebody didn't take me in midwifery school, I didn't know what I was going to do. So, but, we had guys who were doing surgeries, they'd medicate somebody with Demerol and then get them to sign consent for whatever they needed to sign, for a section that they hadn't discussed with them ahead of time. They would just medicate them and then get them to sign the consent. The hardest part to deal with was that the obstetricians from my time were so skilled. The ones I worked with. I know there were bad apples. There were bad apples everywhere, but they were so skilled. And I felt like if we could just combine their skill with the midwifery piece of what we knew, we could have this perfect place. And when I went to work with Mel and Larry, I felt like we had finally found this perfect place. And I imagined that is where I would just end my career.
And I'm going to interrupt you and say that you just encapsulated what it is that I feel like I learned from you. And that was, I never really thought about trying to articulate this before, but gosh, you just did it. You are somebody who comes to midwifery with incredible technical skill that it's clear to me that it comes from having learned a lot from obstetrician gynecologists. And that's not necessarily something that I look to midwives for when I'm just thinking about midwifery and learning, but that was your path. And because of that path, and the fact that over many years, you really honed who you are as a midwife very purely, you put two things together that are like apples and oranges and don't seem like they should go together. And I'm not saying midwives in general are not very skilled, but you have something I can't put into words in terms of just the degree to which you know stuff. You taught me skills that most midwives don't have. And I know that you learned it from them. And so I want to respect obstetricians and gynecologists more than sometimes I show publicly, because I'm kind of shaming the profession, but I'm never shaming individuals.
No, and that's kind of what I meant was that there were guys, and they were all men until Bonnie and Kathy came. There were some real misogynistic guys practicing. So I'm not saying that everybody was. You and I both know that you and I would go to heads on when you would try to bring in new stuff that I'd be like, Tom, no. And yet it would take me some time before I would evolve to it and see the guidance in it and the truth in what you were talking about, and trying to stay away from midwifery, what I used to call the myths, the things that we knew but we couldn't prove. And I would just glow every time science would prove something that we knew already.
Of course, whether it's delayed cord clamping or it's anything else. And we're like, hello, we've just been doing this forever. And yeah, I mean, that's another big thing. And I think I talk to clients about this more than I do even students, because I think students inherently know this. But I talk to clients about all the things that we know from years of wisdom that research either has a hard time showing because of the fact that we really can't ethically randomize pregnant people in research, but also research studies that are not about a drug and are not going to make anyone money. And like, there's just, no one's going to invest
way to do it.
things.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so
Yeah.
there's a place in which we have to understand that as long as something isn't dangerous and we don't have a reason to think it's dangerous or harmful in any way, we just need to let people do whatever the frick it is that they want to do, whether it's through their labors or through their whole healthcare experience, right? And you just melded two worlds, and I think multiple generations in your career, and passed that on to me. So I thank you so much for taking the time to share your stories that overlap, right? Like these two birth stories with your journey into nursing and your journey into midwifery. And also just for the way in which we've always been able to really respectfully disagree on some things, but also just know that like probably 80–90% of the things we totally agree on. And it's just a very small subset of things that we don't, but I think there's just such great mutual respect. And I just, I love you. And I thank you so much for teaching me everything that you knew and for your long career and service. And I'm so glad I have your birth stories documented. Last question. When was the last time you told your birth stories before today?
I tried very hard not to share them with, you know how when patients ask you, so what was your birth like? I would try very hard to separate my birth story and tell them that it didn't make any difference about my birth story. But when I was teaching, I used to say to people, guys have war stories and women have childbirth stories. And the farther away from our births we get, the more detail we're able to concoct. And I don't believe that we inherently remember most of the intensity of it. We remember the gestalt of it, but the particulars of it we miss, for better or worse. It is just an experience that we get through, and we all get through it differently, but we all get through it. And what I shared with patients about my births was how much I loved them, and how fascinated I was, and how incredible my body was at doing what it did, no matter what I asked it to do, and that the respect I had for my body. But in terms of telling stories, the specific story, I would only tell it when women asked me when they came in for their first year postpartum. We would talk about birth stories. So I've told them before. I've told my birth stories before. They just, most moms now think my first birth was a giggle. They're like, how did you do that? Like, but a lot, I tell my breastfeeding story a lot. That's one of the things I would share with women right off the bat. And you asked me what I think has changed. And I think we went from women who wanted to be a part, they wanted to be integral in their birth. They wanted control over their birth. They wanted to control over their bodies again. They didn't want to be asleep anymore. And the physicians at the time didn't know what to do about it, but they were like, what I saw a lot of was this kind of hands-off, yeah, okay, you want to do it yourself? Go ahead, do it yourself. And then when they couldn't, or we know how much support it takes. So when it didn't happen, then the physician the obstetrician would step in and go, see, I told you, this is, so instead of preparing them and helping them and supporting them and helping them to do what they wanted to do, they kind of were like, okay, go ahead, do it. And when you can't do it, you'll have to come back to me. So this need for physicians to have control over the process was also important. And then we got into this blame thing, that if you couldn't have didn't have a natural childbirth, that you were somehow, you've screwed up, or you were less of a woman, or you hadn't practiced enough, or whatever. And then this whole I don't want to say blame as much as one-upsmanship or something happened. And then all of a sudden it was, well, I can have an epidural if I want to. It's my right. And then it became, it's my right to decide that I want to have a cesarean section, even if I've never labored before. And all I could see was this newfound wanting to get control over their bodies, but not having the support to do it in a way that was respectful of what their bodies were.
You've seen and done a lot. Wow.
Yeah. I'm always grateful for what I've lived through and for what I've seen and who I've met and who was part of making me who I was.
Robin, thank you so much for doing this today.
Tom, thank you. You know, you've always been smarter than I was. And oh no, absolutely true. And I am always fascinated by what goes on in your brain, and how you bring it to fruition and how you articulate it. So I'm so grateful that you asked, and I wish you the best of luck.
Hey everyone, it's me, Tanya, your host here at the Mother Wit podcast. You know I sometimes invite my clients on the show to talk about their birth stories and postpartum experiences, but I want to tell you a little bit more about what those clients and I actually do together. I started Mother Wit to help people in the perinatal period achieve their health and wellness goals. That means whether you're hoping to conceive and struggling with high blood pressure or high blood sugar, or you're having trouble managing anxiety or depression in the postpartum period, or maybe you just need support and advocacy between prenatal or postpartum visits, I can help. Get a discount on your first consultation with me at motherwitmaternity.com using the code FIRSTCONSULT 10% off. That's 10% symbol, all one word. I'm looking forward to working with you and maybe having you on the show too.